So Brett, here we are. Welcome back to the 12th installment of Sheepdog Brotherhood.
I'm glad you can count that high, Doug. I was
Yeah,
worried.
well, God did bless me with 10 fingers and 11 toes. So we're going to be good for a while. Um, I'm kidding. I have 10 toes, but not all on one foot.
I figured.
Um, I think what we do need to continue the thought before I hit the record button, we need to come up with like an intro ditty and our logo that pops up on the screen. So talk to the producer and see if we can make that happen, make that a reality.
I'll do that, Doug, right away.
So, okay, Brett, kick it off. What do you want to talk about?
So here we are. It is the day before Easter. So first of all, happy Easter, everybody. And we're going to be keeping this, I think, short. Sometimes we say that, and well, it doesn't end up being too short. But yeah, so we were talking beforehand, have some interesting thoughts. So for me, I was talking, I wanted to share a story that happened to me about a week ago, which I think speaks to some of the topics that we talk about here on the Sheepdog Brotherhood. And so I was having coffee with a couple of buddies of mine who love this concept of the Sheepdog Brotherhood, by the way. And we were talking about a lot of things, hilarity kind of ensuing. And gentleman started talking about through a series of events how he had met this young Korean American lady here in Dallas and become friends with her. And
he's an older guy, right?
He's an older guy. He's
okay.
he's in his 60s. He's probably 30. So this is like when I say friendship, that's what I mean, like true friendship. He's a married man. He's a very virtuous man. It just she needed some help, and so he and his wife helped her. And so through that interaction, got to know her really well, became friends. And so now they're kind of sharing stories. And I think she's around 30 years old or something like that. And she was talking about her friends who were young women. So let's say they range anywhere from late 20s to early 30s, and how they were having just great difficulty finding men like worthy of a long-term relationship, and gave one example of a young lady who was really interested in this guy. And I think he was in his early 30s. And she eventually, she asked him like, "Hey, what do you do for work?" Right? That question is going to come up sooner or later. And he's like, "Oh, I'm a full-time Uber Eats driver." And okay. And then she inquires a little bit more, and he lives at home with mom and dad and has lived at home for a long time. And I could see from her perspective, look, there's nothing wrong with working. At least the guy's working, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what she detected in that was just this lack of motivation to become something greater, right? Mm-hmm. And why on earth would she be interested in the guy who was satisfied with that kind of life? And this was just one story as an example, but what the young lady was telling my friend was that all of her friends who are young women in that age group were having the same kind of struggle, finding virtuous men, holy men, ambitious men in the sense of wanting to be great. And when I say ambition, I don't mean like, take over the universe through some big corporation, but just ambition to want to become everything that God wants them to become, using their talents to the fullest. And they're just not finding that out there in the world. It's not that they're not looking, they are. And they're just not finding it. And it made me think back to, Doug, as I've told you, my oldest son works with, he's a coach, working with young men who kind of grew up in this environment where they were spending their elementary school years, their middle school years, their high school years, their college years, not doing like you and I did when we were younger, where we didn't have all these distractions, these digital distractions, where you and I were like intermingling with, young girls, women, getting friends from the time we were very small. Well, that's not the case with a lot of these young men who are now in their 30s. They were like the video game generation. So they were down in their basements playing Call of Duty and other kinds of things like all day long. And I have a feeling that that continues through, the younger generation right now. And it's like, you may think the ability just to interact with the opposite sex and do it skillfully and not awkwardly is like imprinted in your DNA. It isn't. It's a practice. And my son's coaching, when I hear the stories that he shares about some of these men who are now, some of them are in high tech, no surprise, and they're very successful. I mean, they make a lot of money, and they haven't got a clue how to interact with a young woman. I mean, it's like, they say that public speaking is like the biggest fear in the world. Like, people are more scared of public speaking than they are of dying or something crazy like that. I think it's similar for these young men. It's like the thought of them like actually approaching a young woman in a public setting and starting to have a conversation and interact and try to build something from there absolutely terrifies them. So you start to hear, granted, these anecdotal kind of stories, but I'm just wondering if it's probably just a bigger trend that we're going to be dealing with for a long time.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't see it right now. I mean, I work with a lot of older men, sort of like people our age and not really younger. In my last career, which I'd done for 2 decades, I came up at a time in that career where it was expected that I give up everything for that job, right? And weekends, holidays, I was on call 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 7 years. No vacation. I just worked every single day.
Wow.
And it was a career path that made a lot of money. But I mean, after 20 years, I hated it. I absolutely hated everything about it. I wanted out. God granted that wish for me. Not by my own choosing. But in doing that, as time went on and people became more familiar, not more familiar, but as people, wanted to get into that industry, and people were getting younger, right? Like, we're 15 years on my career, 20 years on my career, and the younger generation is trying to get into that job. They wanted the spoils of that, but they were not interested in the work that it took to get to the level that I was at. They just wanted what I had, at 25. They just thought that they should have what I have, but without having to do any of the work to get there. I heard somebody talking, recently about, our parents and their first home, what it looked like, how big was it, how many rooms did it have, right? It was probably a very small house.
Yeah.
And you had 5 or 6 siblings in that house. And everyone was on top of each other. You all shared rooms versus where they were later on in their lives, where they now had a much bigger home. Everybody had their own bedroom, right? Like, they started here and they worked their way, to the other end of the spectrum. But those kids, when they decided it was time for them to buy a home, they didn't want to buy the starter home and work their way up. They're like, well, we just should have what mom and dad had. Anyway.
Yeah, I wonder where that comes from. I can probably put my finger on one aspect of it. I'm sure it's complex, but so my kids would tell you back when they were playing sports and things like that. So we're talking about, 10 to 15 years ago, even more in some cases. Gosh, I'm old, Doug. Man, this was the beginning of the, what would I call it? Everybody gets a trophy generation. And my kids just happened to be athletically blessed, so they did quite well in sports. But I remember, especially my youngest son's baseball team, where it really struck me one time when there was a young boy great kid, but was just given no talent in terms of being able to play baseball, especially around the idea of it takes a lot of hand-eye coordination to, connect the bat to a moving ball. It takes a lot of hand-eye coordination to actually catch a ball. And this kid, God just didn't give him those skills. And yet it was kind of incredible the way the coaches and I would just say let's just call it the general team community I would almost call it like deceiving this young boy into thinking that he was actually good at baseball. I'm being a bit extreme there, but it's like he was truly terrible at the game. He was a great kid, but he was terrible. I mean, I don't think he got a hit the whole season. And it's like, how can you, what are we doing to a human being, a young human being who's being formed when they step into something and it's very clear that God didn't give them the skills to do that? And yet you talk to them as if they were like Babe Ruth or something, like an all-star Major League Baseball player. And I think that really, I think the intention is, self-esteem and all that. I get it. But I think what happens is it does something in a young person's brain, which tells them something that isn't true, that it is true. And that they're like entitled to trophies and championships and all that thing without both the skill and the work. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be better? And there's a way to do this in a very charitable way, where there is no doubt in my mind that kid was given incredible talents in other areas by God, because that's how God works. Whatever that could be, maybe it's, I don't know, music, something. And wouldn't it be better to kind of like say, well, okay, this isn't your thing. Let's go over here and try this thing. Or, maybe, for example, he was athletically talented, but in his feet, right? He could kick a soccer ball or something. But my point is, go find out what that thing is. And then really help that kid go all in on that and not only build his or her self-esteem in that area, but also you're telling them something that's true. It's like, you're very good at this. God has obviously given you talent here. Let's continue to work and develop this. And so that they know that it's a consistency, it's an integrity based on truth, rather than trying to build something up in a young person's mind that's obviously false. And it's very unfair to them, tying this back to, it's my first job. When am I going to be promoted to manager? Or shouldn't I be a manager, like right off the bat, Like, no, you shouldn't be a manager. You can't even tie your shoes at this job yet. What, are you crazy? And why do they have that expectation? I think a lot of it comes from that kind of thing where we very unfairly deceive these young people into allowing them to believe there's something that they really weren't.
It's not their fault.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking at the current generation, and it truly, I don't think is their fault. Think about it like this. We've started this group, the Sheepdog Brotherhood, and you have a vision and I have a vision of what a sheepdog does, like a real sheepdog out working and protecting a flock.
Mm-hmm.
That's a dog, right? It's a dog. Compare that to a Yorkshire Terrier that your grandmom has, right? One dog has a purpose and is working from the very beginning. The other dog, through no fault of its own, is a dog that serves only as a companion.
Yeah.
It barks, it wants food, it wants to be let out.
It's a lap dog, basically.
It's a lap dog. Its expectation of how its day will go is to be catered to.
Yes. It's
And
pampered.
yeah,
Yeah,
you
for
know, it
sure.
rides around in a baby carriage because there's some dogs like that,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not the dog's fault.
Right.
It's how that person chose to take care of the dog. And again, I'm not saying this is I'm not laying blame. I'm just looking at a situation and running it through my brain and sharing with you and anyone who's listening how I see it. So the current generation, and I saw this great video this morning. It's kind of apt that's popped up today, but it was a video about this guy talking. If there was a draft today, and 18 to 25-year-old men were drafted,
Mm.
they would be commenting like, "Man, the enemy is making some really mean tweets about us," or pollen's really high. Do you think we can hold off on the invasion today because my allergies are crushing me, right? Like they they grew up like the Yorkshire Terrier
Yeah.
as lap
Mm.
children, right? And again, I'm not finding fault. I'm just saying they're just like me. Like all the foibles and all the insecurities that I have is a result of how I grew up, and overcompensating for one deficiency on me and how I've been. You know, I've overcompensated and I did these awful things, and that's just who I am. I can choose to acknowledge it and move on and challenge myself in other ways. Um, and I think I was saying before we started, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like military conflict and where we're at, and what would happen if there was a draft today, if we were conscripted, into war, and comparing that to what we refer to as the greatest generation, right? The generation of
Mm.
military age men who went off to fight in World War II. You and I very vividly remember September 11th. If you compare September 11th to September 12th, 2001 to December 8th, 1944, right? Is that right? Or the date right? 42.
You're close enough.
Okay.
I think so.
So the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed and the day after the Twin Towers were attacked and America was attacked. After Pearl Harbor's bombing, there's video evidence, there's photographic evidence of the men that went and stood in line to go enlist and fight for this country. September 12th, we do not have similar images to show the
Mm.
patriotic,
Mm.
go stand in line. I didn't go stand in that line.
Yeah.
I didn't go. My best friend was already in the service. He was in the middle of officer candidate school. Man, my first thought was like I was terrified what was going to happen to him. But when you look at December 8th and you think of, well, why did all these men who weren't asked to, they went and volunteered? And it comes down to their parents and maybe grandparents. A lot of those guys were first generation Americans.
Mhm.
They weren't Italian Americans, they were Americans. They weren't, Greek Americans, they were Americans. That's how they saw themselves. Their parents had left a country because they saw the writing on the wall. They wanted a better opportunity, and they moved to America to track down that opportunity, to fight for it and work for it. And so many of those men who were standing in line to go and fight for their country, they grew up hearing stories about what the old country was like. What was it like growing up in Italy, in the teens or in the late 1800s? And holy crap, like let's go to America where there's opportunity and we can go and build that country and be a part of it. And the men who volunteered grew up in a small apartment with six brothers and sisters. They all slept in two rooms of an apartment someplace, and dad worked three jobs to make ends meet. And maybe dad wasn't giving them hugs and going to their t-ball games. Like that wasn't a thing that happened. but they knew what was at stake. They saw evil, and they knew that they needed to go and fight evil because of the stories that they heard growing up. And they knew how hard their parents worked to put a roof over their heads, to give them the opportunity for a better life. And those men went off to war. They came back from war. And now, right, that generation created the baby boomers. But that generation came back, and the economic boom that we had as a country after that, because those guys grew up with little. They fought evil, and they came back and said, like, I know what evil looks like. I know what hard work looks like. I'm going to go do those two things. And I'm going to go fight the one and do the other. And that led to a time of economic prosperity. And then their children grew up, what we call the boomers. They grew up with the spoils of that.
Yeah.
And then they had kids. And then, we've had this time of no true invasion on our shores. We haven't had a true evil power that threatened our own prosperity, that our own civilization. And we've grown up like the Yorkshire Terrier, where, what are you talking about? Like, there's dogs out there that are fighting wolves that are at the gate trying to kill us. Like, that's crazy. I eat, Scooby snacks every day, and I watch television while sitting on my owner's lap. Like, how easy life is. Like, why ever would I go outside and go fight off wolves? I'm not cut out for that. So it's not this generation's fault that they wound up here. But I'll be damned if we're not all in a position where we're going to have to rely on those people who were ill-equipped to stand up. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to, as painful as it may be at times, we're pointing out where we're at. We can't change if you don't acknowledge where the hell you're at. So I think we're just trying to say, like, look, society is not in a great place. Men today are not in a great place. You and I included in that, right? We're not sitting on some perch looking down and pointing out how rotten everything is. We're just simply acknowledging,
we need this too.
Yeah,
badly.
exactly. Yeah. And I know, for me, being involved in this with you and getting some of the feedback that we're getting from people, whether it's direct messages and emails and through LinkedIn, it's resonating with people. And knowing that we're striking a chord with people is the motivation that I need to continue to push myself and to say, you know what, don't slouch here. Keep putting in the effort and keep doing it, because other men, whether you ever feel it or not, you're relying on me and I'm relying on you, because when I encounter a hard time, something difficult, and you've been there for this past year, has been, really God putting my family in the crucible, right? We're in the refinement process.
Yeah.
We have nowhere to go but up from here. And it's you specifically and other friends and other men who've been there to help hold me up when I couldn't hold myself up. And I owe it to you and to those other people to try and become a man that I think God has called me to be. And that requires, it's not something I can do on my own. That the men that we are called to be and the path to get there is not something that we do on our own. We do it in community, and we do it through God's grace, and we do it through acknowledging the fact that God's will for us is exactly where we're at today. It isn't, God's will for me is not something that I can't see. God's will for me is where I'm at right now. And I need to do the best job that I possibly can in this time, in what I'm doing. And I need you and other men, and I want to be that for other men. I want to be a servant to other people that need the same help that I need.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do here. Not necessarily poke a finger in people's eye and say, you're lazy, you play video games, you're 75 pounds overweight because you're eating Twinkies and, not being a productive member of society. We all feel that call in our hearts at times and know, like, man, I don't think I should be doing this. Yeah. But where do I go and how do I get to the other side? And, maybe it starts with listening to a podcast. Maybe it starts with seeing a T-shirt that resonates with you. But that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Doug. It's as you were talking, I was thinking about that well-worn phrase, at least in the Christian community, iron sharpens iron, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems interesting to me that I'm not sure any culture has figured out like how to do, like you were talking about the greatest generation. And you could argue that culturally, the greatest generation's children really kicked off everything, all these problems that we're having now in terms of cultural rot, wokeness, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. And you start to think, well, how on earth could that happen? These people who had gone over and really just faced evil, whether on the front lines or support role, and knew that to them it was like an existential kind of battle, right? Survival. And for them to experience that and then come back and somehow we're not able, I'm generalizing obviously, somehow we're not able, at least on a grand scale, to pass on even just to their children about how to be vigilant about those things, the things that you need to do in your life in order to become a great person like the people of the great generation. And they just weren't able, obviously, they weren't able to do that in a culture that had now shifted from one of trying to fight for its life to one that was now swimming in abundance quickly, right? And it's fascinating to me. It's like, what is the secret? And I'm not just blaming America, because there's this well-known theory, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically the rise and the fall of cultures and countries and empires and all those things. And it follows a very well-worn path that's repeated over and over and over. And there is this, it's kind of, I'm messing it up here, but something like, a great struggle. You're going up the hill. You conquer the great struggle. And then from that point, you go downhill. And then you reach like the bottom again. Your culture is completely degraded and falling apart. And then something happens again. And it's like this massive upheaval. Let's go fight the evil, and you go up again, right? It's like this cycle. And it's like, it's curious to me that human beings, not just our country, but all countries, civilizations around the world, have never quite figured out how to solve that problem, right? It seems it's just a matter of time before the culture gets soft. I don't know anyone that could make a strong argument right now that our culture across the board, but men specifically, that men in our culture at large are not soft. We're soft. All of us, like you were just saying, we're spoiled. We feel entitled to certain things. You just gave me kind of when you were talking about the house with the 7 kids and the dad working 3 jobs and the mom, slaving away, which was very common not that long ago, kind of made me think about, gosh, how entitled I've been growing up, how spoiled I've been, and how many millions of Americans are in that, boat. I don't want to diminish for a second the fact that there are millions of Americans who face very extreme conditions day after day. I get that. But man, there are a lot of us who are living on the spoils of the victory of the great generation still to this day, including our kids and their kids. And it's very interesting. I read an article really within the last 6 months, which was talking about Ukraine, and then it backed up and talked about Iraq 2, Iraq 1, Afghanistan, as you were saying, post 9/11. And he was saying the exact same thing that you were talking about. He goes, isn't it interesting that compared to World War II or World War I, or even Vietnam to some extent, we general Americans and the populace don't feel any negative effects from these wars. Like No one is sending us an email or someone going on TV saying, "Well, guys, sorry, you're going to have to ration your food for the next 6 months while we're over there doing this." There's nothing like that at all. Or you can't, like 3 days out of the week, you can't drive your vehicle because we need to conserve fuel. Nothing. It's just like we just go, like nothing changes. We just go about our business. And it's kind of like if you're not feeling in some way that you're part of that war, and that was the guy's point. None of us feel the sacrifice of being part of those wars at all. Nothing. Well, how can you go back into, like you were talking about in the Great Generation, where it's like, oh, this is an existential threat. I need to go sign up for this and save my family, save my friends, save my town, save my state, save my country from this evil, that if I don't stand up and go do that, we're dead, right? It's incredible. And so, like you said, it's like there has to be a way, and we're proposing one way here through this. There has to be a way where even if we're not involved in World War III, God forbid, we have to stay sharp as men. And I know we've talked about that on an early episode, but men crave this desire to fight for something, to have a purpose. And so when you read, it's in the news every week now about the levels of depression across the board, but particularly in, is it called Gen Z, whatever it is, the younger generation, the teens and the 20s, especially how men are just completely lost at sea, like feeling like, what's the point of my life? I have no purpose. I'm confused. I don't get what's going on. What am I supposed to do? Levels of depression and psychosis are like off the charts in this generation. And I think that's a big part of it. There's just, they haven't been given like something to fight for. And I think that's what we're proposing here. It's like, there is something to fight for. There's always a war going on spiritually, for sure. And that's why when we talk about God has assigned as a duty to every man the dignity of every woman, because clearly you can look at things going on in our culture, and men certainly are not at large fighting for the dignity of women. Quite the opposite. When we look at pornography, abortion, and a host of other things. And so that's what we're saying. It's like, hey, it may not be against, our overseas adversary in country XYZ, but right here in your own culture, in your own heart, in your own soul, there's a huge battle going on, which is eating away at our culture, destroying it from the inside. And isn't that worth fighting for? Because if you win that battle, then we can all be happy. We can all be filled with joy. And you just don't see that in general in the young men, in the generation of young men right now.
It makes me think. I think part of what we're trying to do here is just shine a light on it, right? Because if you take a tuning fork and you smack a tuning fork and it's vibrating, and then you hold it next to another tuning fork, that tuning fork now starts to vibrate. Sometimes we don't recognize the problem, right? Sometimes you're so deep, deeply ensconced in the issue, you don't recognize that you're in the middle of the problem or the issue. And I think we're not trying to point out and say, you're bad, you're lazy and you're a sloth. It's more like, look around you, see what's going on. You in your heart know what is truth, right? God has written that on our hearts. We know what is true. We look at a thing. If you were on a subway and you see some guy smack a woman in the face, right? Like, well, that's not right, right? Like, in your heart when a thing is right or not right. And I'm just using that example, but we see that in all things. We celebrate when someone is pregnant. Oh my God, you're having a baby. That's wonderful. Congratulations. And we're excited. Oh, feel my belly. I just kicked. Oh, yes. But then in the next moment, you're like, yeah, but I think I'm going to kill it. I'm going to, have a doctor go in there, cut it up to pieces, suck it out. And, but somehow on one hand, we're thrilled and excited because we know it's a blessing. And if you saw somebody on the side of the road, like beating a child, you would acknowledge that that's a bad thing. And in your heart, even the people that support abortion, I think they know in their heart what it is, but they do the mental gymnastics to try and convince themselves that it's a good, it's necessary. Well, they're going to have a bad life otherwise. I mean, they do these mental gymnastics to convince themselves that the position that they're taking is right because it's right for them in that moment. So they think, and all we're trying to say is look around you. There are plenty of battles to fight, many of them spiritual. And we're just trying to say, look, men, we need to get together. We need to acknowledge where the evil is, and we need to be better and stronger so that we can fight that evil where it is.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to call it out and then arm each other with the fact that I'm here for you and I can help you with it, and you can help me with my battles and my struggles, and stand up and know that if I stand up and say that a thing is wrong because it's wrong, and I know in my heart that it's wrong, and you know in your heart that it's wrong, I know that I'm not going to be standing alone. I know that there's going to be someone else standing shoulder to shoulder with me that says, I've got your back. I'm here with you to help fight.
Doug, you made a great point, which is, I was trying to think of that dude. He was in the government a long time ago. I think he was a George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld. We don't know what we don't know. That kind of thing. Some statement like that. We don't know what we don't know. So it's almost like, well, if you're a man, no matter what generation you come from, and the one thing you may know when you wake up in the morning is, and it would be paraphrase something like this: I'm not happy. Like something's wrong. I don't know what it is. There's some things I think I might know what it is, but I just don't feel like filled with joy. It's like, well, God doesn't want you to live that way. It seems to me if you're not filled with joy, then there's you're out of alignment somewhere, right? You're disintegrated somewhere. Your integrity is not intact. And rather than just sitting around trying to just roll with it and go, oh, it's the way it is, I would say it's a sign that there's some kind of battle going on within you, probably multiple battles going on. And so rather than, to your point, rather than just face that on your own, why not get together with like-minded men who know also that something's wrong with them and with other men in general, and talk about these things and get like to the core of what's going on? Because I guarantee you, just as you and I have experienced with each other, when you sit around and you start talking about these things, something happens. It's like, I would call it, as a faith-based person, I would call it the Holy Spirit enters the picture and speaks to you through other men, and kind of like, whoa, oh, I never thought about that, or I never had seen it that way, and start to like put a finger on like what it is that's going on, rather than denying that there are battles going on inside of you, because there are. That's the same with all of us. Rather than denying it, it's like, well, start to identify it, get advice from other men who care about you and who want to see you live a life filled with joy, and do that for each other. That's the whole idea of the brotherhood, right? It's like we can do that for each other. And I start to think about, it's like, if we talked about earlier in a previous episode, it's like one by one, and then it's like 10, and then it's 100, and it's 1,000. And these kind of men who recognize the battle, thousands and thousands and thousands, these kind of men who recognize that battle and help each other with a brotherhood, band of brothers, really over time, I believe, have the real opportunity, and I would even say likelihood, it's very plausible, could have a massive impact on changing the culture in a positive way. I just always, it's a vision, a dream of mine. It's like, I'll even say millions. So if millions of men started to live like this, where in brotherhood, they were truly fighting those battles and the various battles that kind of sum up to our ultimate apex point of God has assigned as a duty to every man, the dignity of every woman. I believe it would transform the culture. So in my mind, that's really, from a big vision perspective, that's kind of the direction we're headed.
As you were saying that, it made me have this thought. What if we decide and do a LinkedIn Live, right? We can host a live podcast on LinkedIn, and maybe we do it next week or the week after. We promote it, and we see if we can get some people to join us for this roundtable. We can set it up so that people can log in and pose questions to us or post comments, and start to do this in a live scenario or a live situation. This one, and I say it because of this. This past year, I started creating content on LinkedIn and developed some friendships, like honest to goodness friendships with people that I've never met, people that have reached out to me and had conversations. We've done podcasts together, but like we've developed relationships with people I've never met. It's possible. And I think, this Sheepdog Brotherhood, it isn't about like, well, these guys live in Texas and I'm in Oklahoma, or Oklahoma's a bad example. I'm in Rhode Island, right? Like, well, that's never going to happen. I'm not going to get together. It doesn't necessarily have to be in person. So we can talk about this offline, but I would like to do a LinkedIn Live. And here's my ask for you. When we post this, this episode on LinkedIn, I would like us to each call out in LinkedIn and tag a person's name, 2 people each that have had a positive impact on our lives that we just want to address in the body of the post. And I've got 3 people that I'd like to call out. One, a guy named Joseph Miller, who's become an actual honest to goodness friend to me through LinkedIn, somebody that helped support me as we were going through what we were going through this past year. Another guy, Keenan Hart, who just a great guy that I met on LinkedIn. He's doing great work with his business to help people with their mental health. And, I'd like to say J.W. Fryermuth, just a person that's been a tremendous example to me in my life, a tremendous friend. And I want to call them out. And maybe through the process of calling them out, other people will be notified that, we're acknowledging these 3 people. Do you have, not to put you on the spot, can you think of 2 or 3 people that you would like to acknowledge?
Yeah. One is my good friend who you know, and just an incredible human being, an incredible man. This is Jeff Scheffelbein, who does great work with his organization, Undivided Life, and also has a very hilarious podcast called The Beatted Dudes. Certainly him. And then I'd have to think of some others, but yeah, why not just start calling out some guys and getting them involved in this for sure.
And let's just call out men that we know that are doing good work, wherever that may be. Actually, I'll add another one. David Simmons, he's doing work to help. He has an organization called Return to Duty, and they are trying to help active duty, special operations, military members get the proper medical care that they deserve and need to help them, get back on their feet or even get back to active duty. He's a great guy, and I love the mission and what he's doing. And anyway, I'd like to share that. You and I can connect offline about how we go about acknowledging these dudes. But great men doing great things, and that's what we need to do.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, let's call it there. Have a great day. Have a very blessed Easter to you, Brett, and to anyone who's watching this. I hope you all have a wonderful and blessed Easter.
Same to you, brother.
Take care.